A promise is a promise. I said I'd be back in May, so may I say, I got a new tutorial I pulled together to explain a little on airbrushes and their care for those of you that want to know more on the subject, or probably want to upgrade from the regular brush to the air one. There are 3 types of airbrushes. I have 2 that I can show you at the moment. This is my main one I use currently to work. It's an Iwata HPB Plus, and as you can see, this is a gravity feed airbrush, and it's also a dual action, meaning that you have to push down the trigger to get air, and then you pull back to get the paint to flow. It's fairly simple to manage once you get the hang of it. This is the old airbrush I used to work with. This is a Badger 150 model, and it's also a dual action airbrush, but this one is a Siphon feed model. There is another type of airbrush which is a combination between the gravity feed and the Siphon feed. It's called the side feed. I haven't actually used these in the past, so I don't have much information on that one, so I'll just stick with what I know for now. All airbrushes can be taken apart, and this is very necessary to be able to clean it properly, but I will get to that in a little bit. Every airbrush is very similar to the rest when it comes to parts. You have your handle set you can take off, the needle spring, and the needle chuck guide. The front will also have several parts you can dismantle. This one has a needle cap that all airbrushes have, and it's normally removable, and for that all you need to have is a little wrench that is made specially for that airbrush. All airbrushes normally come with one. Then you have the needle head. I know that the nozzle can be removed, but I was never able to do it on this model. It does have 3 different heads, fine, medium, and heavy. I've always used the fine head for details, and use the medium and heavy ones for when I need to have more coverage on a kit that probably made you go like, oh my fucking god, is that huge! This and several other airbrushes have the same features with parts you can change, especially the nozzle and the needles. Let me take a short time to explain a little on compressors as well. In order to use an airbrush, you need a good compressor. I have an Iwata Silverjet that has a max PSI of 60. I won't really go into details on horsepower or anything like that because, to tell you the truth, I've never really understood it. I only know about Psi Regulation. This model has a pressure regulator included, so you can regulate the air pressure that goes into your airbrush. The higher the PSI, the more pressure you will generate, making your airbrush spray with more power and flow. The lower the PSI, the less paint you will see flowing through your airbrush. If this is not clear enough, let me explain with a different analogy. You know when you have your garden hose and you open a valve, water pressure is not that high. But if you apply your finger on the end, you will generate enough pressure and the water will now turn into a jet stream. It's the same thing with the airbrush. So if you have a large area to cover, use a high setting on your compressor to get the paint flowing. If you want to do details, lower your PSI to be able to achieve it. Each paint is different, and it will sometimes require a different PSI setting to be able to use it. Regular hobby paint like Tamiya, Mr. Hobby, and testers will require a PSI between 15 and 25 for a regular flow. Other paints will require a higher PSI to be able to use them, like Creatix paints. I've learned that I can't use them with a low PSI. Sometimes they're too thick, so I usually crank it up between 30 and 35. For detailing, the recommended setting would be around 12 to 15. That way, your paint will come out very finely and will be able to make small details on the piece you're working on. In conclusion, you need to have a compressor that can go up to 60 PSI as a max, because you really don't need any more than that. Getting an industrial one is not recommended because you can screw your airbrush up really well. Probably end up with something like this. So getting a smaller one designed for airbrushes is the best thing you can get. The most important thing you can keep in mind is that your compressor needs to have a pressure regulator. If not, you will always get the same pressure. There are some compressors you can buy online or at your regular hardware store. The things you can look for it to have would be pressure regulator, to be oilless so it's maintenance free, and overall the price depending on your budget. There are several brands you can look for. Iwata, Badger, and Patch all have their own compressor models. You can also look for generic ones that are not that expensive if you're looking to keep an eye on your wallet. eBay has a lot of compressors for beginners that are mostly included as a combo with a generic airbrush as well. When taking care of your airbrush, you must always leave it as clean as possible. As you can see, my airbrush is really messed up. I left it like that on purpose for this tutorial and to show you basic cleaning tips. My airbrush has a needle cap I can remove. As you can see, it gets really dirty, so that's going to be cleaned as well. The body itself is dirty due to the paint spilling from the paint cup, so it also needs to be cleaned, as well as the inside. When your needle is very dirty and gunky, it will get stuck. When you move the trigger, you'll notice that it doesn't retract after pushing it back. That's a sign to take it all apart and get your cleaning tools out. The first thing I do is remove the handle. The handle lock, spring, and needle holder along with the needle. Sometimes it will be really stuck in there, so to pull it out without damaging it, you can get some rubber or latex and it will let you have a better grip for you to pull it out, revealing all the dirty paint on the needle. After I remove the needle, I go ahead and remove the needle cap, the head, and the nozzle to be able to clean them. When you remove your nozzle, be super extra careful because this tiny piece will most likely forever lost if you drop it. I lost it once, and after 2 hours of painstaking search, I found it. While looking, I found out that purchasing a replacement would not be a good option because these little critters are very expensive. My replacement would have cost me $50, so remove it and place it somewhere safe. The next thing I would recommend is buying a cleaning brush set for the airbrush. I bought mine at E2046. It was really cheap compared to the ones I saw on eBay, and they work just as fine. I use 3 things to clean: alcohol, Windex, and water. Since I mostly use acrylics, that's what I need. But when you use lacquers or enamels, you will need to use their respective thinners to clean your airbrush. I dunk my needle cap and head into alcohol so that the paint can start unsticking. Then I use my brushes to clean each piece. If I want a really good clean, I also use Q-tips. They also remove a lot of paint left behind by the brushes. Get a small piece of cotton and soak it a bit with alcohol and start passing it onto your needle. Be very careful not to clean from the very top to the bottom, as you could actually hurt yourself. It is a needle after all, and you can probably screw it up as well. So just start cleaning downwards just below the point of the needle. For the inside of the airbrush, I take some Windex and pass my brush on the inside where the trigger meets the valve to release the air. Since not a lot of paint gets in there, passing a little Windex and cleaning it with a Q-tip later works just fine. The body of the airbrush also gets a good cleaning. I just use alcohol and wipe it all off. When I'm done with that, I go ahead and insert the brush into the tip of the airbrush that doesn't have the nozzle anymore. And when I'm done brushing, I get a little bit of Windex in there and just brush a little bit more and then just rinse with water. The thing I'm also removing from the head is not gunk. It's Teflon tape. When you screw on your cap, sometimes air escapes from that connection, making your airbrush splatter your paint. So adding just a tiny bit of this will prevent the air from leaking. Lastly, I very carefully clean the nozzle, securing it with some pliers. Of course you can use regular tweezers, but I just had this one on hand at the moment. Once everything is clean, the last thing you want to do is lube your part. No, not that kind of lube. Lube to keep your airbrush in tip-top shape. You can use petroleum jelly or regular bike chain liquid fluid. Both work okay. Add just a tiny bit to the trigger and on the needle, and then just put everything back together. Some other items I can recommend is getting a cleaning station and an air filter for your airbrush. The air filter is so that water doesn't go into your airbrush when it's connected to the airbrush compressor hose. The cleaning station is just so you can clean your airbrush in between colors. So just spray in the remaining paint into it along with your cleaning liquid. Now for those of you with a Siphon feed airbrush, the way I used to clean my old one is that I would have 2 bottles for cleaning, one with a cleaning liquid and the other one with water. I would connect it into the one with cleaning solution, put the cap on, and then pull the trigger. Since the air doesn't have anywhere else to go, it goes down to the bottle. so it would be a tedious job since I had to do it several times until it was clean. With all this info, you probably want to ask, what airbrush should I buy then? Okay, I can't really tell you which one to buy, but I can give you several examples. But as always, the determining factor is your wallet budget. If you have a low budget and you're just getting your first airbrush, I would recommend a generic brand or even a Chinese one that doesn't cost that much. The only problem with these airbrushes is that if one of the parts gets damaged or lost, replacing them is almost impossible. So it would just be used, lost, and then throw away. If you want a decent airbrush, I can recommend either Badger or Apache brands. They have a lot of good models with different price ranges from $50 to $120. A really good brand and almost always recommended is Iwata Medea brand. Their website actually tells you the specs on each model and for what they can be used, so I highly recommend reading and informing yourself before trying to buy anything. I know this is not a lot of info on airbrushes and how to decide on your first one, so I really recommend you visit Airbrush Guru's website for the full 411 on what airbrush to get depending on your needs. You will find the link at the bottom of the page in the info section. The last thing I want to explain before I go is that when using an airbrush, sooner or later you will encounter several problems with it, as airbrushes are somewhat delicate. At times, people will experience the following scenarios. Paint splatter when pulling the trigger. The paint doesn't flow, though the air is passing through the nozzle. The paint turns grainy when it touches the piece you're working on, or that the airbrush sporadically sprays instead of a constant flow. The first two scenarios and the last one are caused by the airbrush being dirty or clogged. So either case, you will need to check your airbrush parts and clean them very well. For the third scenario, it's most likely caused due to the paint not being thinned correctly. You're using a very low PSI setting, or the nozzle could be clogged. Normally, it's one of these three reasons, so you will need to check your thinning, PSI settings, and clean it if needed. I really hope this info can be useful to you. I've really only had 3 different airbrushes, and my knowledge is only limited to what I have experienced. But there's a lot of info on the internet on the stuff I didn't mention. So grab your keyboard and get your friend Google to help you find what you're looking for. Well, that's in a good sense. Until next time, my resin monkeys.
I got him!